Alright, so this is something that I definitely want to get out the way because I've been meaning to talk about this for a while. From Arjuna, he says, can you do a video going into deep detail about the differences between Excalibur and Caliburn and their respective abilities? And this is really important because I remember going back and forth with somebody from the community and they were trying to tell me that Excalibur was the sword that Arthur pulled from the stone. In Fate, I mean. And I'm like, people really think that's the same sword? Yeah, we really got some work to do. So I always knew I'd come back around to this eventually. And it is something that's easy to confuse, especially considering that there are interpretations where they are identified as the same weapon. But we know that the idea that the Fate verse runs with is that it's based on the anecdotes that they were two separate swords entirely. In Fate, Caliburn is the actual sword that Arthur pulled from the stone. And then Excalibur was the magical sword that he received from the Lady of the Lake. So we'll start things off with Caliburn and work our way up. Caliburn was something that was meant to be a sword of selection. In other words, the wielder was symbolic to being the chosen one. It's a trend that appears not only in Arthurian myth, but many other myths and some that's come before it. It does have counterparts. Grom, for instance, the sword that Sigurd wields, the slayer of the dragon Fafnir, his sword is a sword of selection. The sword Marduk, the same patriot god that defeated Tiamat in actual myth, his sword was a counterpart sword of selection. It actually goes by the same name as him, and since he has the oldest known myth, his sword would be the prototype of these selection swords, and we're able to experience his weapon through Gilgamesh because of course he has access to all the weapons and he comes from that era. The idea in Caliburn itself was that it was rooted in finding the successor to Uther Pendragon. Merlin had a prophecy. He said, hey, whoever is cool enough to pull this sword out the stone is going to be the next future king, and they'll be the only ones who are able to do so. And you know, you had a bunch of guys try to walk up and think that they were big shot, and they were all sadly mistaken. None of them could pull the sword out the stone. And then you had Arthur just waltz up and pull it out with no effort. Because of that, it's always been more symbolic in nature, and it has an overall lower power than the sword Excalibur itself. They can't possibly be said to be on the same playing field. But that still doesn't change the fact that Caliburn is still among the top weapons regardless. The significance of the weapon is so high that even being below Excalibur, it's still better than most weapons. And this is greatly evidenced by the fact that when Cheryl projected the sword in the Fate route, they were able to take Heracles' lives 7 times over. It was that strong. This is something that he wouldn't have been able to tell the story about if he had tried to project Excalibur, because as we know in the story, and especially Heaven's Field, if he tries to project Excalibur, it's too much for his being. It takes way too much energy by comparison. They would need special circumstances for that to happen, and even if they project it, it's only going to be a hollow replica. It's not going to be a true projection like everything else. In terms of who has the sword, we've seen the sword from Arturia in her lily form, which is a version that highlights her younger self when she first obtained the sword. This more so leans into her adolescence where she just became a king. But there is a part of the original myth where Arthur is supposed to lose the sword also. The side material tells us that Caliburn was broken when Arthur was taking part in some non-chivalrous activities. This refers to the matches that he had with King Pellinore. Pellinore was trying to prove that he was worthy of hunting the questing beast. So King Pellinore and Arthur are having some jousting matches, and lo and behold, Pellinore is whooping that ass. And on the third match, Pellinore actually broke Caliburn in half, and he's trying to tell Arthur, bruh, you're clearly weaponless, just give it up. And Arthur basically took on the position of he would rather die than just take that loss to the chin. So he's grabbing on Pellinore's waist. Pellinore is way too big for him, and he just tosses Arthur on the ground, and he was about to kill him. So Merlin decides that he's gonna sneak in a little bit of magecraft just so it would allow him to save Arthur's life. And then he told Pellinore who Arthur was. Pellinore didn't know who he was fighting against. Merlin tells him, sorry buddy, you take his life and it's over for everybody. And though Pellinore beat Arthur in these matches, Arthur championed him for his skill and said, hey, you need to come over to the round table. So that's how Pellinore ended up becoming a part of the round, along with a bunch of other characters, including including his son Percival, because this was in fact Percival's father. And the key point of him breaking this sword during the matches is that it's later said to have been reforged in Avalon, since he was still the one that was fated to protect the kingdom. So at this point, Arthur goes to the magical lake and he ends up getting Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake, who was Vivian. She actually held the sword straight out of the water with her arms and presented it to him. The same Vivian that was involved with Merlin, the same Vivian who fostered Sir Lancelot, same one that gave the sister sword Galantine. She was responsible for all of these things. So now this sword, along with this sheath, was fated to protect Arthur up until his death. And then of course in fate, after his battle at Camelot, he asked Bedivere to return the sword back to the Lady of the Lake, because there was no way for him to peacefully go into the next life without him doing so. The sword would just keep him ever present. Now, in terms of Excalibur's creation, although Vivian was the one that was said to have given the sword itself was said to be created in Avalon. And in fate, it was created by 6 great fairies known as the Subbells. They were fairies that were higher than all of the others in the reverse side of the world. And essentially, they were the ones who were instructed by the world, the planet itself, to create this sword. Fairies being some of the oldest creatures to exist, they answered directly to the planet. They answered to Gaia. All of this was in 12,000 BC. In the proper timelines, they did what they were supposed to do. They made the sword. So when the alien invasion happened of the White Titan Safar, and it came to destroy the planet, it was defeated thanks to the unknown wielder of this weapon. Someone who is either a time traveler or someone that predates all of the spirits that we know about. In the Lostbelt timeline, which is a hypothetical what if everything went wrong timeline, Nasu doubles down on what would have happened had they decided not to do their job. So basically, the Lostbelt versions of these fairies were bums. They decided it would be a good idea to just not make the sword. Could have made the sword, should have made the sword, didn't make the sword. So when Safar ravaged the planet in this timeline, it destroyed everything, including all of Britain, which would also mean it destroyed all of Avalon. Going back to Cernunnos, who was a primordial god who was manifested to point these fairies in the right direction, though he is capable of devastating the planet, he couldn't fight against Safar on his own, nor was he supposed to. So he tried to tell them, hey, I really think you guys should make the sword. They still decided they didn't want to. They pretend to be friends with Cernunnos and actually stabbed him in the back and made a new version of Britain out of his corpse after Safar had destroyed everything. And just to show how low down these fairies were, and you can see this on the hieroglyphics on the wall in the chapter, they tried to spin the story like it was actually Cernunnos' fault. Like he tried to go against them and they were just trying to defend themselves, when really they just made it all up. It's just like actual history. It's written by the winner. So whoever comes after the fact, they have no choice but to believe what's been left behind, whether that be a straight up lie or romanticized altogether. Disgusting. So it's important to understand that Excalibur is a sword that needs to be made, or the world itself will be utterly destroyed otherwise. That's what the stories are literally telling us. Caliburn was just a regular sword of selection from the stone. Excalibur is the magical holy sword forged in the sea of the planet. And by sea here we mean the deepest magical regions of the planet, or in other words, the reverse side. The sword embodies the strength and the wishes of the planet itself. That's why it's top of the line and it can't be compared. That's the reason why it's called the sword of promised victory, because at its best it's like you're going against the entire world. For the abilities, because he did say that he wanted to get into that, as I mentioned before, they're both extremely powerful swords. Caliburn starts at a B and goes all the way to an A+, depending on how it's used, and then Excalibur starts at an A rank and goes all the way up to A++. If we're going by feats, the fact that it was able to take down Safar makes it one of the greatest weapons to ever exist. easily top 10, possibly the best one on record. There are weapons that are actually stronger than it, but feat wise, there's really nothing greater than this weapon at the time that I'm making this video. And a lot of that stems from the fact that you're literally gathering energy from the planet itself, and even greater energy than most phantasms would normally, because they're synced together. Again, Excalibur is a divine construct, which is a completely different vein of weapons that's specifically forged by beings that are at least god level, in this case being Gaia. So it operates differently because it's an extension of the planet. Of course, it's going to have greater power than the rest by default.